So the current generation of GPUs are slowly coming to an end, and we should see some new stuff right around the corner, which is pretty exciting. But I wanted to get one final round of benchmarks and a kind of final recommendations video, if you will, for the stuff that is currently out there. And to be honest, the GPUs that are going to be hanging around for a little bit. We are expecting new GPUs, of course, very soon, but it's going to be the high-end stuff as usual. RTX 4080, RTX 4090, etc. It's very likely that you're not going to see the more mainstream and more affordable cards like the ones that we're going to be looking at today until the following few months after. So yeah, if you're looking at those very high-end models, waiting just a few extra months is probably a very good idea, but the more mainstream cards are still very reasonable to look at. Pricing is lower than ever, and their successors might not be around for a while. And I want to make this very clear, this video is not, encouraging you to pick up a GPU or upgrade your GPU if you don't need to. It's more so for those people, getting into PC gaming for the first time, building their first PC, and they're looking at all of the graphics cards in this price range, and they're just genuinely confused because there are so many to look at. Most of them have very similar pricing and performance, and that's kind of what I want to clear up today. Speaking of which, we're looking at 8 GPUs today, 4 from AMD and 4 from Nvidia, and they all kind of sit in this section of the price curve right here. A little bit more expensive than your budget options, which this generation they are pretty stripped down, but also way cheaper than those super premium options, while also getting you most of the way there in terms of performance. On the AMD side of things, we have the RX 6600, 6600 XT, 6700 XT, and 6750 XT. Performance is pretty close between the 6600 XT and non-XT, just 4 compute units between them, with the XT model also having a slightly faster memory clock. Then we have a big jump in compute power up to the 6700 XT, but then up to the 6750, barely any difference at all. Slightly higher GPU clock and memory clock, but that's it. Then on the Nvidia side, spec-wise, the jumps between the 3060, 3060 Ti, and 3070 are fairly linear, and the gaming performance reflects this most of the time as well. The 3070 Ti though, that's just a small bump over the standard 3070, so you could probably make a good guess of what gaming performance looks like there. We're not benchmarking the RTX 3050 or RX 6500 XT in this video, since all of the testing here was done at 1440p, and those GPUs would definitely struggle. We just wouldn't get much of a meaningful comparison. But for what it's worth, the 6500 XT is not a GPU that I can recommend. It has an extremely cut down PCIe and memory spec, and it's just a bad performer in general. Gaming performance is abysmal for a GPU that launched only recently, and at this sort of price, you're actually better off at looking at used GPUs from 3 to 5 years ago. The 3050 is less worse. It's slightly faster than a GTX 1660 Super or a GTX 1070, and it's okay if you need to get a 1080p gaming build up and running. Now, as a bit of a reference point, before we actually take a look at the gaming benchmarks for these GPUs, let's take a look at the pricing, because spoiler alert, all of these GPUs that we're looking at are pretty good. They're all pretty fast. There's none that kind of stand out as being obviously bad, and the performance is actually pretty close as well. Pricing, on the other hand, that's kind of going to be the biggest factor in which one you pick up. So here are the price charts, which might seem a bit familiar at this point. The white dots here indicate the MSRP for each GPU. The colored dots indicate what you can expect to pay for an actual in-stock listing, and the lines illustrate the distance between the MSRP and real-world pricing. Now, over in the US, we see some really interesting stuff. 3 out of the 4 AMD GPUs can actually be bought at their MSRP, while on the Nvidia side of things, they're about $100 more expensive. Overall though, prices have dropped substantially, and I think this graph shows that pretty clearly. Over in the UK, very similar picture. 3 AMD GPUs here sit just a few bucks over their MSRP, and the RX 6600 in fact is slightly under at £294. Here again, you'll be paying a bit more of a premium for Nvidia, probably an indication that those cards are selling a little bit easier and or have a little bit more performance. Here in Australia, it's pretty consistent with both the UK and the US. Here though, we do have some pretty decent pricing for the 6600 and 6600 XT, both of them actually listed under their MSRP, and respectfully, the Nvidia side of things here isn't too bad either. For some perspective, it was just a few months ago that 3060s here were selling around the $1,000 AUD mark, and 3070s were easily up around $1,500. As usual, it's Europe that looks to have things the worst, with pricing overall for these GPUs just looking a little bit higher in general. So yeah, things there definitely a lot lot more expensive, and we don't see that really favorable AMD pricing that we saw from the other three regions. Each GPU here is equally overpriced. Things here have definitely dropped, but not as much as other regions. Now we'll definitely come back to those price graphs towards the end, but now let's get a little bit more context on performance. For example, the RTX 3070, that was consistently more expensive than the 6700 XT, but what does that look like when it comes to gaming? Well, in Doom Eternal at 1440p, the 3070 leads the 6700 XT by 13%, which is about the same performance here as a 3060 Ti. And let's just get this out of the way, 6700 XT versus 6750 XT, there's a tiny difference between the two throughout every game that I tested here. 6750 XT most of the time is just not worth picking up, unless you can get one that's basically the same price as a 6700 XT. Now, in these first few games, the ordering from top to bottom is pretty consistent. 3070 Ti up top, 3070, then 6750 and 6700 XT roughly equal, 3060 Ti closely following, and then you have a step down to either the 3060 or 6600 XT, and the 6600 being the weakest card here will generally be at the bottom. The two GPUs that you'll typically see shuffling around here though are the 6600 XT and the RTX 3060. Performance there is pretty close, and so is the pricing in most regions. In Apex, the 6600 XT leads the 3060 by around 7%, which is worth noting for a pretty popular title, but both GPUs here can drive a 144Hz experience with lowered settings. Then we have F1, a bit more of an AMD powered title where both the 6600 and XT pass the RTX 3060, and we also see the 6750 XT right up there with the 3070. Overwatch is a bit of a mix. The 3060 Ti, for example, is just as fast as a 6700 or 6750 XT, but the 3060 again trails behind the 6600 XT. With Overwatch 2 on the horizon, I'd basically expect the same performance and scaling as what we're looking at right here. Then we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider. AMD performed a bit faster on average here with the 6700 XT and 3070 basically tied at 121 FPS, and we basically see the same thing again in Forza Horizon 5. Remember, the 6700 XT is actually the cheaper GPU here, which is an interesting point when it comes to value. This title does favor AMD pretty strongly though, and that's why we see the 3060 getting sent right to the bottom of the graph, even below the 6600. On the flip side though, we have Witcher 3, which for whatever reason showed extremely good performance for the Nvidia side of things. Here the 3060 Ti was 13% faster than even the 6750 XT, and we just don't see good performance scaling from the AMD GPUs here in general. Now, averaging out the numbers from those previous 10 games, we see a couple of interesting matchups. Firstly, extremely close performance between the 3060 and the 6600 XT. To make the choice there even more difficult, pricing, if you remember, was only about $20 to $30 difference depending on the region, where either one could be cheaper than the other. Now, if the two are priced identically where you're from, I'd then look at performance in the individual games that you play the most. Apex, for example, the 6600 XT was 7% faster, but also factor in that Nvidia has a few more non-gaming features up its sleeve, like better video encoding, typically better software, and better GPU rendering in apps like Blender. As for the 3060 Ti and upwards, the choice here gets a bit tricky. Performance increases, but so does the price. So then, combining the price data that we looked at in the beginning and the average gaming performance, we can calculate how much frame rate you're getting for every dollar spent. So starting with the UK, the 6600 and 6700 XT come out on top when we look at overall value. Two very different tiers of performance, but both bringing very decent value to the table. Everything else in the UK, pretty much the same, nothing really standing out as a bad choice. Similar picture in the US, 6700 XT now up top when it comes to offering the most FPS for the money, but again, most of your choices here are not that different in terms of what value you're getting. There are some more generally sensible options though. The 3070, for example, over a 3070 Ti is a good idea, and so is the 6700 XT over the 6750. When it comes to the 6700 XT over the 3060 Ti and 3070 though, generally the 6700 XT is the better option when it comes to value, but either one could be a decent pick depending on the region. In Australia, for example, 3060 Ti is probably what I'd recommend because the pricing there is pretty solid. The other thing to consider here is whether you care about things like ray tracing or AI upscaling techniques like DLSS or FSR. If the the answer is yes, and you can kind of see yourself enabling these options and testing them out in different games and, looking forward to that experience, then I probably would recommend spending a few extra bucks for an NVIDIA GPU. It's not that AMD doesn't have these features. They've definitely, implemented and closed the gap on NVIDIA with these sort of things, but NVIDIA has a much larger library when it comes to these features, and their technology has had a little bit more time to mature. So with all of that out of the way, the rest is really up to you. How much performance do you actually need, and how much are you willing to put towards a new GPU? Again, this video isn't aimed at encouraging people to pick up a GPU they don't need, but for those that see a ton of all of these similar models at very similar price ranges and are just genuinely confused. So hopefully that clears things up and you now have a better idea on the pricing, the performance, and the overall value. As always, a huge thanks for watching. I'll see you all in the next one.